Here is Noodler's Walnut, a brown ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
Noodler's makes some of the nicest brown inks out there, and this is right up there as one of their best. There is a very noticeable tone change by nib, and it is only in the darkest form of this ink that there isn't a ton of shading, but the rest of the time, fantastic. Now on non-fountain pen friendly paper, this can be a bit aggressive, though I never had any bleeding from it that touched that page underneath. I guess a spoiler. If I wasn't already in love with Kiowa Pecan, then this might be my go-to brown. I really like using it a lot.
All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib that writes rather dry, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet, a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow, a Lamy All-Star with a broad nib that writes average. The pen for today is a Pelikan M805. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get a great tone of brown with no feathering, with no spread, with great shading all the way through. You can pretty much choose any word and you're going to get a lot of back and forth between lighter and darker tones. Now the soft fine is a very dry writing pen, so if the ink is going to have any kind of it's too light to use, it shows up here, and it's not. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine. There is no feathering, there is no spread, there's almost nothing for shading. It is a beautiful dark brown, almost, but definitely not black. Super dark, not black, brown. Great. Looking at the medium nib, it is a bit lighter than it was with the wet fine. There is no feathering, there is no spread. There is a great tone this whole way through with a lot of shading. Again, like the soft fine, you pretty much cannot choose a word that does not have great shading back and forth between the lighter and darker tones. To choose any word, like mountains. Mountains starts with a little bit darker at the beginning of the M, lightens up during the M into the OU, end of the U into the N, it darkens up, but it lightens up again in the N, darkening at the tane at the end. Looking at the broad nib, it is a little bit lighter than it was with the medium nib. There is no feathering, there is no spread. There is a fantastic tone on the page. Now for shading, it is not shading nearly as well as it did with the other nibs on this paper. However, it still does a great job of bringing in some darker letters. I'm really enjoying the tone that I get here. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelikan M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 7 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. There is no feathering, there is no spread, there is shading about as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. Not as much, about as well though, and especially considering the paper, I like what I'm seeing here. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine. There is no feathering and there is no spread. There is shading going on that's definitely noticeable. Look, it listened on the third line. The L is lighter than the I. It lightens up again into the S, very dark at the T. The EN lightens up. The E gets very dark, and that D is a nice mid-tone at the end. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine, a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. There is no feathering, there is no spread, there is tons of great shading. This is one of the reasons I so enjoy brown inks. Not just the tone on the page, but the amount of shading that you tend to get is really top-notch for someone like me that likes shading. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, tiny bit lighter than it is on the Clairfontaine. There is no feathering and there is no spread. There's almost nothing, there's much less shading. There's plenty of shading. It's going from a light tone to a mid-tone more frequently, not the dark letters like we were seeing on the Clairfontaine, but much more subtle in the changes that are going on, and I'm enjoying it, but not nearly as much as the other nibs on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, there is no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, there's no tone change on here from the Clairfontaine, meaning this is a very opaque ink. With no feathering and with no spread, it still shades very, very well. And I mean, a word that has much less would be dwarves on the third line, but underneath, which is to the right of that, so we can be confusing, the UN is lighter than the beginning of the D, where it lightens up, and then it darkens again at the D, little darker than that at the E, lightening at the R, darker at the NE, lighter at the D, darker at the H. I lost my thought. I just don't know what happened. Had a brain fart. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine. A little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine because it's definitely brown. It's just not as dark. This is a rich, beautiful brown that we're getting right here. Now, there is a tiny bit of feathering that I do see on one or two words. I don't think the camera would have gotten to it yet, but traffic on the fourth line, I see a tiny bit of feathers on the Fs. Not huge. It's the only word I'm really seeing it on. No spread, shading, yes, please, and it delivers beautifully. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine, same tone as the Clairfontaine. There is no feathering. Not this time. There is no spread. We haven't had it yet. There is shading, though not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, but this is not fountain pen friendly paper. It's not coated. It's going to be a bit more absorbent. It's going to go ahead and use some of that up, but east towards Mirkwood, you see shading going on, where E's is a lighter tone than the T at the end. Now towards starts lighter at the top of the T, then goes to a nice mid-tone through much of the word. It's at the DS at the end, much darker. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, tiny bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. There's no feathering. There's no spread. There's that subtle tone shift that's going on. Subtle shading, not huge in shading. If you look at changed on the third line, you see the C is a little bit lighter than the HA. The N lightens up a little bit. The GED at the end goes back to that mid-tone. Looking at the back of the page, you could easily write back here as we have no bleeding or ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It shades just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. Maybe not just as well, but it still does shade. The Clairfontaine showed more of the darker areas, and this shows more of its mid and lighter tones with only the occasional darker tone. Now, it stands out without any kind of a problem against the quad rule, not that I was having any doubt about it going into this. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, tiny bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We get shading the way it's shaded with the medium on the Clairfontaine. Very nice, very consistent, very there, any word. Good shading throughout. Really, choosing a word doesn't do it real justice. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. There is no feathering and there is no spread. There is tons of shading. We're going to do this in justice. And looking at dragon hyphen alluding on the third line, where the bottom of the D is a little darker than the top of the D, it's a nice lighter tone on the RA. It's during that A, it starts to darken a little bit, and the on at the end, a little bit darker. Now, alluding, the AL at the beginning is lighter than the LU, and then the D lightens up a little bit into the IN, and the G at the end, very dark. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It shades just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, which is not tons of dark areas, but tons of back and forth between those mid-tones and light tones. Wow, is this nice to look at. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Califolio Sepia. Here is Delta Brown. Here is Diamine Sepia. Here is Lamy Topaz.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. Often this paper is going to have it a bit duller, not as lively, not as dark. Not a problem here. It has no feather, has no spread, has some shading, though not as much as the Clairfontaine. It still shades well. I'm telling you now, students, bonus points for using this ink in this paper. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, a whole lot lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. No feathering, no spread, shades. Your notes are going to look fantastic. Really, your notebook's going to be on display at that school for generations to come and say, you see the ink this student wrote with? This is what you want to be using. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine. A little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, quite a bit lighter to be completely honest. No feathering, no spread, shades incredibly well. Just look at Mirkwood on the first line, the MIR, very dark. It's during the K you get some dark spots, a lighter letter. Wood starts to lighten up. It's the D at the end that gets very dark again. Shadowed directly underneath it with a very dark SHA, mid-tone D, darker OW, lighter E and a much darker D. It's really, boy, oh boy. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get almost nothing for shading. It's really not there. Very plain brown, but I'm saying plain because there's nothing else really going on, but it does look good. I can spot a few words that have shading in it, not the standout quality here. Looking at the back of the page, that student can easily turn the page right on the back and won't have it have bled through to the page underneath.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Sailor Studio 130. Here is Noodler's Green. Here is Ackerman, their number 16.
Here is Twisby Blue Black.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather, it does spread, it does shade. So I already spoiled it at the beginning. It doesn't bleed through. I tend to worry if it shades on copy paper because frequently I'll see shading and then it bleeds, and here it doesn't. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, much lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Feathering, yes, very under control. Truly very, very under control here. Spread, sure, slightly. It's still copy paper. Shading, yes, from lighter to mid-tones, none of the darker tones. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine, quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Tiny bits of feather, tiny bits of spread. Neither of them are a big deal. I think this is a great ink if you use 20-pound copy paper as far as the way it looks on the front of the page. Shading, sure, there is a little bit. Again, it's the mid to lighter tones. None of the darker areas stepping out here, but not bad at all. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Yes, it still has tiny bits of feathers, really tiny. Yes, it has tiny bits of spread, really minor. It has tiny bits of the darkest areas of shading, like at dots of eyes or commas. Not huge in shading. Most of this is unshaded, though you can find a couple mid-tones with the lighter tones that are here. The moment of truth is always the back of the page. Now look at this. There's very minimal ghosting that's really going on considering we're on copy paper. It was only with the medium that the ink really got deep into the page. Of course, nothing touched the page underneath. But look at this. With the wet fine, you could probably write your notes back here. Soft fine, write notes. Broad, write notes on the back of the page. You can write on both sides of the page. Copy paper, most nibs. Absolutely amazing.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The dry soft fine showed off great tone with shading that was well done. The wet fine was the darkest and didn't always shade the best, but the super dark yet not black look of it was really memorable for me. The medium gave you every tone this ink had to offer, from its lightest to its darkest. So yes, it's shaded and like a monster. And the broad was a distinctive walnut furniture tone with a slight amount of shading. Now for me, this is a really tough one because they're all really interesting in their own way. But I'm going for the wet broad that you're seeing me write with right now for a great tone and shading. And it all came down to the fact that I had this in the Pelikan M805 with a broad nib to really be able to see it like this and enjoy the heck out of it. So go out there, ink up your favorite pen, and write something.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.